Can everyone hear me okay? Yep. Great. Thank you all for showing up for the last session of the day. I'm sort of impressed that as many of you are showing up to talk about management at a technical conference, so thank you. I actually think this is a really interesting topic, mostly because, I see our profession and our industry rapidly changing over time, and great technical leadership is really needed at a lot of companies now, and really within our industry at large. So a lot of companies, I'm sure many of the ones that you are at, are now having two tracks that you can progress in your career. Oftentimes you can interchange between those two tracks, but there's really one that can oftentimes be seen as sort of technical and a complete technical progression throughout the course of your career at a company. But there is an alternative track, and I think it's one that we don't oftentimes talk about very much, but it's the management track. It's moving towards leadership. It's really having a seat at the table where strategy is being discussed for a company. And I think a lot of you here are really going to be great additions to that table and bringing your knowledge from hands-on experience with technology. So really what I want out of this talk is sort of three things. One is what I'm just saying is technical leadership is really important and we should really think about it and consider it. Two, it's difficult. It's really hard. So we should sort of recognize the difficulty in understanding management and what it feels like, and moreover what success looks like. And then three, this has happened before. We have great technical leaders that we can look to in the course of our history. So it's interesting to sort of look back and see what kind of solutions they came up with to deal with some similar problems that we might be facing today. So quickly, a bit about me. I'm a partner and a technical lead at a company called Carbon 5. So we're a consulting company, which is really fun for me. I basically get to work with a really wide variety of organizations, everything from working with really big companies like Moody's all the way to startups like Masterclass. We've worked with wild technology with Protocol Labs, building like distributed web, which could talk for hours on that, it's crazy. All the way to like very applicable technology like Stitch Fix. So anyhow, if you have questions about Carbon 5 or you want to hear about anything about the company, I'd be happy to chat. But really my background was as a software engineer. And I got into software development mostly because I didn't want to do this. I was really scared about business and this idea of being stuck in sort of bureaucracy and having to like deal with acronyms and all of the things that came with what I considered to be management. And so I specifically went into a field where I felt like my work was directly valuable to someone via software, via products that were being released, and that I could tangibly feel that. And over time, I really drew a lot of delight out of that, being able to deliver software, watching people use it, getting better at it, getting better at the craft. But what I started to recognize was really big, impactful work requires large teams. It requires collaboration, and it requires leadership. And so moving more into a team lead, moving into management, really drove different kinds of change in this world. And I got really interested in that facet of it. And it's kind of interesting because this is sort of part of also what we experienced as humanity over time. So this is really, for as far as we can go back to time as we know it, progression in terms of productivity and efficiency, so really, gross national product. And what you're seeing here is, broadly speaking, everything to the left of the 1800s here is a kind of just a population distribution is what you're looking at. And then everything after the 1800s is, again, broadly speaking, a facet of taking really wonderful human genius and then applying things like steam, electricity, and ultimately software to scale that genius and make it more efficient and more productive. And so we're seeing today, this is, of course, the first, second, third, and now what some people are calling the fourth industrial revolution. And what we're seeing now today is software is at another inflection point. We have about 6% of US GDP, this is a hard thing to measure, is attributable to sort of the digital economy. And mostly people are speaking about that as like the consumer internet. But there's this notion of sort of spillover, and that spillover is when technology, as we are now recognizing, hits manufacturing and hospitals and transportation and infrastructure and airline. Everything basically is going to be hit by technology. And so what this means is that all of you have job security, probably for a while, but also it means that we really have to think about how do we train all of the people that we are going to need to work in this sector, and to do it in a way where we are considering things like leadership and ethics and collaboration and standards. And it's tough because the employment is quadrupling. This is probably just going to get larger and larger and larger. But a lot of our universities don't necessarily have the faculty that is educated in ways in which to train the next generation of software developers. So there's a lot to consider in sort of where our industry has to go and where our profession has to go and how we train up all these people, because we really do want to open the door wide to bring more and more people into this industry, because there's a lot of need there and there's a lot of value to be gained and ergo wages to distribute. So that's a whole conversation in and of itself. But looking back on history a little bit at how our profession has progressed, there was definitely an area of time, mostly back in like the 60s and 70s, where a lot of software development was done in really what companies would call the IT cost center. And it was a cost center because basically they saw it as money that just had to go in without direct applicable output to the business. And so in that era, basically 10 to 15% of capital was spent on what they considered to be IT development, things to make the company more efficient. And it was generally R&D groups, efficiency groups, and there was very little representation of software development on an executive team or at a management level. You fast forward to now, and technology is seen as a strategic driver for most companies. Again, the spending is just getting huge, right? 50% now, it's probably just going up and up and up. And we now have representation at the table, right? We have directors, VPs of engineering, CTO, CISO, all of the C is open for all of the people here. But it's kind of fascinating in that this is kind of a recent development, actually. If this is a search for Chief Technology Officer, I also did this for VP of Engineering and a variety of other titles, and you see this like crazy blip that kind of has happened in the recent past. And the crazy thing to me is there was a lot of software development that happened up into the 1990s. But what we see now is really, this is where we are being asked to be part of leadership, because technology is a driver of business and it's a driver of value. And the craziest thing to me is that our first US CTO, there's a lot of need for technology in every country now. The first CTO was just in 2009. So that's kind of an interesting tidbit to think about. So all I'm saying is I'm getting to the point that this room of people, you all are excellent software engineers. You are, top of your careers. You have a lot of opportunity to take a career path that is very broad, very diverse. And one thing I want to call out is that going into management isn't sort of a dead-end path. I know of many, many people that have gone into management and then flipped back into a technical career path. So I talk to a lot of people that get really nervous, like, oh, I'm going to lose all my skills, I'm going to get into management. It's this sort of like funnel into just being in that suit. It's not the case. I do see a lot of people go back and forth, and I think your path can look winding, it can look direct. It's sort of like up to you to choose. But it's interesting also to consider what a career in management looks like. I think when I started out, when I was considering it, it's sort of, to me, I thought it would be roughly like this, right? You are on a development team working with lots of other developers, broad scope. You move into a team lead, you are starting to kind of have more impact over larger groups. Then you make that jump to managing your first human. From a psychological perspective, work, that is a big, big leap. You are all of a sudden not just managing kind of value add by software delivered, you are managing someone's like happiness and career development. So it's a bit of a twist. And then there's also a bit of a twist when you go from managing a team that is working on code that you are very, very familiar with because you have worked on it as well, to managing teams that are working on code that you have never really had experience with. And it can be scary because you feel like an imposter. You're like, I haven't worked on that code. So there's another sort of psychological twist that happens there. And ultimately you get to the top, right? And like sometimes you're like, oh, I'm the boss, like I get to pop the champagne, things are great, it's gravy. This is what it feels like. Everything just sort of rolled down onto your head. So it can be a very scary experience to recognize that everything is sitting on top of you. You are ultimately responsible for all the work that is happening at those tiers above. And it can also feel super lonely down there, actually, because you don't necessarily have a whole bunch of other people to talk to about the difficulties that you're facing every day. Oftentimes they're HR issues and they're very sticky and complicated. So it's really important when you're getting down into these sort of leadership levels to open yourself up to your peers, to network more. But again, I would argue you can look in the past and sort of see what others have done to solve. So for the sake of this talk, we're going to look a little bit at another profession that came about at the turn of the century and had a similar rapid development that we are kind of seeing in software today. So as a side note, in sort of a similar time period that we saw from the 1990s to now, where we have seen software engineering quadruple, mechanical engineering during that same sort of frame of time had a 2,000 increase in jobs. So in the Industrial Revolution, this was taking everyone that was doing agricultural farming and moving them into factories. So it was a huge need that was put upon people to learn, people to understand how to cooperate with one another in factories, and all of this was really quite new. So there was a couple individuals that came out of this period that had some really big progressions in sort of how groups would work well with one another. And one of those guys was a man by the name of Frederick Winslow Taylor. So Taylor kind of has an interesting background. He did not study formally management or business or any of those things. He actually applied to Harvard. He got accepted, and he ended up not going because he had a deterioration in his eyesight. So he decided to go into the factory and become a worker, like hands-on. And he worked for a while in the line with everyone else as a mechanical engineer, and then slowly worked his way up the chain, and eventually became sort of chief engineer of a factory by the name of Bethlehem Steel. And during that time, his experience, sort of hands-on, understanding kind of the ins and outs, allowed him to come up with a lot of efficiency methods that are now, we can kind of see actually still in place today. So one of the big ones was standardization. You can kind of see a parallel in that today. We see a ton of standardization in software that makes us more efficient and capable of collaborating more efficiently. There was also a wonderful bit of work that was done by a couple by the name of Frank and Lillian Gilbreth. These are two, if you've ever seen the movie Cheaper by the Dozen, this is a story about them. They basically took their scientific management home to the workplace. Lillian also is credited with sort of starting the study of ergonomics in the factory. So she did a lot of work there to sort of keep the factory workers in a place where they can be happy and productive and efficient. If anyone here has ever seen a Gantt chart, Henry Gantt was the creator of that. He actually worked with Taylor at Bethlehem Steel. And then a variety of other things came about this. Wage incentives was a whole nother issue that came about because unions at the time were kind of struggling to figure out how do we actually capture work that's done in factories and provide salaries around it. So there was a lot of work done there. And ultimately all this led to things like Henry Ford's production lines, things like lean manufacturing, and a lot of this has led into what we now see in sort of agile software development. But there's some bad in this too. Taylor definitely was a stickler for rapid efficiency. So he was looking at things to the point where it kind of got to the almost making humans machines side of things. So he kind of went super far in the scale of efficiency, oftentimes to the disinterest of the individual. And he also had a interesting sort of approach where he felt that certain people were applicable for certain work and others were applicable for other work. And if you take that to the extreme, that's basically eugenics. So sort of something to watch out for there. And then he also was a big proponent of basically taking all decision-making power and giving it to management with very little input from the workers. Obviously, we see where that can go wrong. And it kind of sparked some really dramatic strikes that happened, really violent ones at the time. So there was a lot of unrest about how do you run businesses properly? How do you do management properly during this time? But one thing to consider when you are doing management is it's a constant balancing act, right? You really need to be able to empower individuals, give them autonomy and agency to do their best work. But if you do that to such a degree, you lose out on the inefficiencies, right? If everyone wants to write code in one particular way in every single language, we all know what would happen there. But if you go too far to the other extreme and everything is standardized, you leave no creativity with people to come up with better solutions. So the job of management is really to constantly figure out where you are in the slider and to find that happiness point. And that is not a point that ever stays in the same place for any duration of time. It is a constant struggle to keep that balance in check. But I would argue there's a lot of experience you have as a software developer that can be pulled over into that world of management. We all have to understand how to take really complex systems and abstract them out to make them simpler and to understand how to tweak them and make them better over time. But I see it as basically sort of three fundamental blocks. The first, great communication is just the foundation of everything. You can have the best idea in the world. If you cannot effectively communicate that idea, it's lost. Second, our business results. As developers, we are now part of business in a way in which we can drive real results. And it's our responsibility to understand what that looks like. And then finally, motivations. This is absolutely the most complicated one, but it is the force multiplier of management. And it's where you really can unlock a lot of efficiency and productivity. So I wanted to give a call out really quickly. The gentleman that actually inspired me to really look into history and do some of this research was a fellow by the name of Michael Deering. He has a school called Harrison Metal, unfortunately based in San Francisco, but it's a fantastic general management course. I've sent tons of our management there. I've recommended it to a lot of companies. And it's probably the closest you could get to having a very fast MBA. So he's a fantastic teacher. I would highly recommend it if you're interested in checking it out. But he introduced me to a woman by the name of Barbara Minto. She's a woman of many firsts. She was part of the first female graduating class of Harvard. She was the first female consultant at McKinsey. And she's the first example of someone that I feel like came up with a very sort of algorithmic approach to communication. And she did it in a book that she wrote called The Pyramid Principle. And her argument is effectively, we have a tendency sometimes, if we are in the weeds, to run and try to communicate with someone with all of those details that we know first. And typically what happens is those people will pick up on those details and then try to bring their own theories to them as quickly as they can. It's just how the human brain works. And she was like, flip that on its head. When you're trying to communicate something, if you're trying to come to a decision with a group of people, first and foremost, state your point. And then you fill in the details underneath it. And she basically has it architected in this way where it's a pyramid. The details get more and more fine-grained as you go down, and that's how you architect your argument. Another thing that she talks about in the book, and that I use, honestly, all the time, emails, it's great, is this idea of situation, complication, question, and answer. And effectively, what the situation does in any form of communication is it creates this like baseline where it's factual. It's, we all can agree that X. And what you're doing in that is that you're removing any bias, any kind of complication within that initial statement, and everyone can kind of agree on that. What you do next is you introduce sort of your opinion, the complication. From your frame of reference, this is where it's getting tricky, and this is what I think is happening. From that, an answer or a question usually will come about, and then you can provide your answer. So it's just a quick way to effectively remove a lot of bias initially in a conversation to get everyone on the same page, and then introduce sort of your nuance to it. And it can kind of avoid a lot of initial conflict. And I'm going to reach a little bit into historical here, or like broaden it up a bit, because Kim Scott is definitely not, I would say, a historical figure. But she wrote a book called Radical Candor that I have to say was one of the great reads for me. Because I think as a manager and as a leader of teams, oftentimes you have this tendency to want to lead with good news and good feedback, because honestly, it's just easier. Having to say the hard truths to a team oftentimes can be a really, really hard thing. So she came up with this wonderful 2x2 that kind of is just a gut check between you and the people that are reporting to you of how you're actually giving them feedback. Oftentimes we feel like, oh, you're doing great, keep doing what you're doing. But in the back of our heads, what we know is this person is doing great, and they are great, but they could be better in the skills that they have. And if you gave them some absolute candid feedback about how they could progress in their career, they're going to be better for it, you're going to be better for it, the team's going to be better for it, and the company's going to be better for it. So sort of understanding where you are in these quadrants is kind of critical. And the one key point that she makes, which is the most important, is it's not where you think you are giving feedback, it's how it's landing in your reports. So it's sort of important to check in with them and say, you know, am I being obnoxiously aggressive? Do you feel like I'm being candid with you? So it's really how it lands that's important. So I'm going to move into business results. This is something that definitely, from a management perspective, can get hard. But what you're trying to do is, first and foremost, know for yourself and be able to communicate your team what success looks like and what you need to do to achieve it. And then the second piece of this is how do you build the team that can achieve that success? So the first bit, we're going to go back to Andy Grove. He is very well known from basically building up into it. He was an engineer by trade, and he took a very analytical approach to how you manage and run companies. He wrote a book called High Output Management. I think it's great. It's very wonderful to read as an engineer because he was an engineer and sort of thought about the organization as a system. But what he brought to the table was this idea of the art of management lies in the capacity to select from the many activities. because ultimately there are tons of things that you can do as a team. There's tons of things you can do as a business. But what matters most is the things that at the end of the day are going to make that business successful, keep revenue coming in, and keep people employed. And so those are the things that you need to concentrate on. So he brought up a technique that has now been adopted by many, many individuals called OKRs. And it's really around this idea of being able to frame the objectives of the company from the top level, what the results would look like that noted that you achieved that objective, and then you basically tier those down into each part of the company. So Google uses this a lot. Many, many Silicon Valley companies have picked this up. I think companies all over are kind of looking at it. Some people call them goals, some people call them OKRs, whatever they are. The intent is really to ensure that the company is capable of describing what their objectives are and what results that met those objectives would look like. And that makes it so much easier for teams to basically look at that and say, all right, well, in order for me to meet that goal, I'm going to have to do X, Y, and Z. And so they have their objectives, their key results. Some of the other tenets of this that he describes are, there's this notion of sort of going big, trying to be ambitious. There's a lot of gamification that can happen with OKRs, and I would say that's a constant sort of tweak as management you will need to do. People are really good at gamifying them. I think the other thing is, again, back to this earlier point, you shouldn't have like 20 OKRs. You're just never going to achieve that much stuff. Also, for teams to really hold 20 things that they have to accomplish in a duration of time, it's impossible. So time-bound and not too many. And then the final note is, and this is, people do this differently, but tying this to bonus or comp just exacerbates that gamification system. So people will take the KRs and the objectives and they'll tweak them to basically do better for themselves in terms of comp, even if it doesn't really make sense for the actual objective. And then the final thing I'll say is that 70% is dangerous. I have definitely seen teams where they create these unrealistic expectations around that 70% of what they think they can achieve, and your quality, your technical debt just goes wacko. So just be very, very careful if you get too ambitious. It's kind of sometimes better, particularly with teams where you're trying to kind of just get efficiency and expediency and a lot of collaboration working well, to set the bar low and show some success and then go for the ambition. The other thing, and I feel like I'm really happy that this is now something that is generally being talked about quite often, diversity matters, and there are great metrics to show how much it matters to the bottom line. There are dollar bills behind this, which I love. But the other thing to consider is diversity is not just gender, it's not just race, it's not just age, it's everything. It's people's backgrounds, it's their life experience. What they're bringing to the table is different frames of view. And that's what you're looking for in your teams. And there's kind of an interesting, really anecdote about not a person, but a building. And a building that had quite a personality on the campus of MIT. And it was called MIT Building 20. It basically was built in World War II when there was no space for the faculty at MIT. There was no ability to get construction materials because the war was going on. And so they kind of put together this slapshod building, had tons of asbestos in it. Anyhow, they put it together and then they kind of handed over the keys to the faculty members. And this included, the orchestra, the janitorial area, the linguistics, Noam Chomsky was in there, the scientists for the nuclear, physicists. Everybody was housed in this building, and they all just kind of grabbed offices and then just reconfigured the offices to their best capabilities. So in one case, I think they had a particle accelerator that they just crashed through the ceiling in order to build it. But this building created a notable amount of achievements, more so than any other building, any other sort of production facility in any other university. And it became a really sort of a spawn of a lot of folks such as Steve Jobs, who looked at the architecture of this building and how it forced an interchange of people that normally would never interact with one another in the interest of trying to generate more creativity and innovation. So when he was building the Pixar studios, he actually looked to this approach to get the architects to put, the mailroom was central, the bathrooms were all central, trying to get people to sort of pass by each other as often as possible. So it's kind of an interesting thing in that what really you're getting out of this is just the interchange of ideas from very different backgrounds. And that's the sort of thing that can create innovation and creativity. And you're going to get the same thing if you get yourself diverse teams. So I'm not going to read this, but this is important. These are the numbers that you're going to get if you take the time and you invest the resources to get yourself diverse teams. So there are dollars at the end of this funnel it does mean, though, that how you do it requires investment up front. So if you are far down the path and you haven't got yourself a diverse team, it will be hard to backfill in diversity. It's very, very difficult to come from a culture that is already very in place and has kind of like one frame of reference to just tack on people. It's very uncomfortable for those people, and it's just very hard to do. So as soon as you can, consider diversity. If you're building up a team, do it as early as possible. But if you are at a stage where you know that you need to make an impact here, some of the things to think about are these. And this takes time and resources. Looking outside your normal sources in order to meet people that don't look like you, very important, but that takes time. Doing things like not hiring on gut culture feel, but actually having rubrics that you understand are qualifiers for people that are going to be good for your company and for the business, very important. Also, once people are at your company, allow them to develop. Give them a sense of belonging by giving them projects that you think they can succeed at. Giving people stretch projects is a really important way for people to feel that they belong and they can develop their careers at a company. So all of these things, as well as providing an inclusive environment, are really important to keep people there once you have done the work to bring them in. All right, so the last chunk that I'll talk about is really about motivation. And motivation is really where management kind of turns into leadership. And it's really one of the hardest things. But great managers are just a force multiplier of the people that they manage. And great managers will create great cultures. Great cultures will attract great employees, and great employees will create great companies. So this is where sort of the rubber hits the road, and it's really important to think about it. One of the first things I'll touch on is this idea of like, how do you build up a team? Teams really are a portfolio of skills. Everyone on your team is going to be very, very different, from where they came from, to the skills that they have, to their psychology, to how they work with one another, to how they work, period. So thinking through that as both the portfolio of skills you have, but also the projects, the types of projects that you have at your company is really important, because once again, this is where you're going to have to sort of balance things out continuously. And there was an interesting sort of approach that was brought forward by the late great political scientist David Stokes. And he kind of looked at companies, particularly this was sort of in the realm of research, but he recognized that there were sort of these 4 quadrants of projects that were initiated at companies. And he kind of framed them around the great scientists. And what you see in that top one with Bohr, this is where you're doing research that doesn't have direct application to the business. So you're not doing like feature forward development that's going to be deployed to your customers, but perhaps it's paying down a ton of technical debt, or maybe it's a code spike. These are sort of, or maybe you're generating a tool kit that can be used by a bunch of the developers. So it's research that increases the knowledge of the team and the business, but it isn't necessarily directly applicable to the business. There's another chunk, which is basically what you're delivering every day. Features delivered to customers every day. So that's that pure applied research. You know the use case, you know the technology you need to build, and you're building it. And then there's that sort of interesting one at the top right, which is Pasteur's quadrant. And this has to do with really unique novel thinking. This is sort of very ambiguous. It's innovative projects. It's spikes on creative ways in which to do something with technology for the company. And so when you look at those quadrants, those are all projects that we sort of see crop up in our work. But what you can also sort of see is that there's kind of different experiences of those projects. So for the Bohr quadrant, oftentimes this work is very detailed, it's methodical. Oftentimes there's not sort of a driving need from the sales or the marketing team, so there can be a little bit more maybe time to complete it. In the Edison quadrant, this is very tangible. People can feel really accomplished when they're doing this work because they're seeing it delivered to customers. But there oftentimes can be a lot of deadlines on this kind of work. So you oftentimes see a lot of value in transferring people back and forth between these two, because if they're strained from kind of the requirements of a deadline, maybe they want to work on some detailed methodical refactoring work. So it's both understanding sort of where your teams are and kind of their appreciation of the work that they're doing and sort of their fatigue of that specific style of work. But also you find that certain people just really love one of these types of work, and kind of understanding that and balancing out your teams for it. And then the last one is probably the hardest one, because it can oftentimes be seen as like the most fun work, and yet oftentimes that work totally gets thrown away, and that can feel really sad to a team that just spent 3 months working on it. So really recognizing that these are sort of the psychologies that you're playing with and ensuring that the team kind of has the opportunity to be where they feel most productive and satisfied in their work can be helpful when you're thinking about retention and keeping people around. Another thing that can help keep people around, and this is definitely a buzzword that keeps cropping up, but there's been work that's been done on this since like the 1960s, but recently a woman named Amy Edmondson has done a ton of work to sort of pull this back up. And really, I think a lot of it is because we are now in a world where knowledge workers have to collaborate at such high frequency and to such depth of detail that feeling safe to be able to express your opinions actually becomes efficient and productive and really the only thing that can get decisions made over time. So I highly recommend kind of looking into her. I'm not going to dive into all the research that she did, but psychological safety is just one component of sort of greater organizational requirements in order to leap over that confidence hurdle to get to that place where everyone has a voice, everyone is engaged, and there's a high degree of knowledge sharing. That left-hand side, implicit voice theories, all of these other components are actually required as well. And these really have to do with the idea that sometimes it's not really felt as you progress in your career. As a boss, you can walk into a room, and if you have a pet project or if people know that you have an inclination towards a certain decision, oftentimes they're not going to say what they think because they sort of know that the boss already has kind of made his mind up. You have to know when you're doing that, and you have to almost overexert your ability to sort of distance yourself from the decision in order to allow people the ability to say what they want out of this and to be able to have all the voices be heard. Because whether or not you like it, your opinions will oftentimes be weighted to a degree that you might not actually see. Okay. So skipping forward. So this is the last one, initiative and incentive. So I sort of wanted to bookend. Taylor had one approach, and it was interesting because he worked with another fellow by the name of Harrington Emerson, who came with a very, very different approach to management. So where Taylor was really skewing on the side of like hyper efficiency, making everything standardized, Emerson had this dream that there could be this organic interplay between those that were doing the work and the management their role really was to streamline the function of those people that were doing the work. And so he really saw a couple things that I think are important for us to recognize as managers now. One of that is, as managers, we really do have a moral contract with the people that are doing the work. We have to respect the work they're doing with their opinions about the work, and we have to take the details that they give us and then draw that into the work that we have to do to streamline the path for them to get that work done. I think the other note is the second bullet point, which I see this happen all the time. The unusual worker back in the factory day was somebody that could just haul a bunch of pig iron around the factory. And in our world, we sort of have heard this notion of rock star developer or ninja developer, whatever the heck you want to call them, but this hero culture where one person is seen to be given all the hard stuff. That person ends up being the gating factor of the rest of the team. If that person isn't put in a place where what their job is and what they're told and what they're incentivized by is to spread their knowledge and their skills throughout that team, if they are the one that can pick up the hard stories from the backlog or they take a certain part of the code base because they own it, again, that becomes someone that once they leave, all that knowledge is gone. And so instead of making them a force multiplier, you basically have made them the gatekeeper of knowledge. So I think he brought up a point, in the 1900s that don't insist on having these unusual workers, right? Really understand that the collective is the thing that's going to make productivity happen. So I just wanted to call that out. And then finally, I loved that he wrote this back then. Bonuses were paid to foremen back then, not based on the productivity and utilization rates of the employees. It was based on those employees being engaged in the system, being capable of describing the work to be done, and basically being loyal. So that's what foremen were actually incentivized by. And this is kind of just a fun picture. Each and every one of these cards were cards that described the work and the machines that the work that was going to be done on. These were created by the people that were doing the work. And then the management would grab all these cards together and figure out what the most efficient way to describe that work for the factory was to be. So this basically is sort of like, if you can imagine it, the story map of a factory. Okay, final wrap up here. There are going to be pitfalls And this is not a complete list. This is a very subset of a much larger list. But these are some of the things that end up being, or at least I've experienced them as roadblocks along the way. One of the big ones is failure to delegate. I think as you're getting into management, particularly if you have done the work in any recent past, sometimes you feel like, oh, I'll just take that and do it because I'll do it really quickly. Again, you're sort of doing the hero thing. But giving people an opportunity to take big projects, to take the scary thing, and allowing them to fail with a certain amount of guardrails put in place around them, that's the way that you start to delegate out work, and that's the way that you make the whole organization more efficient, and frankly, your job way more enjoyable. The other thing is, I talked about this before, but underestimating, or even worse, sort of chasing the shiny new tech. Watch out for this. It oftentimes can sound really appealing to those that are asking you, like, what cool thing can we do next, tech people? Don't go there. Like, really be considerate in what actually is going to provide value, be it the leading edge, not the bleeding edge. And then finally, ego. Whether or not you know it, we all have ego, and whether or not you know it, you oftentimes can kind of wear your emotions on your sleeve. And that really does affect other people. So understanding how you can kind of recognize your own weaknesses and recognize where you are maybe overstating things or overstepping your bounds. It's hard, but find someone on your team that can kind of like raise their hand and be like, hey, you know, I think the other team members might have had an opinion on that. Maybe next time sort of like say something to allow them to have more of a voice. So sort of keeping that in check. And then the last thing I'll leave you with is, I sort of felt this, and I hope others do too. Management is the opportunity to help people become better people. And practice in that way, it's magnificent. So thank you all very much. I have some resources at the end of these slides. They'll be online. If you have any other questions, I would love to chat about this. I have all sorts of ideas on our profession and industry and this career path specifically. So thank you all for coming.